Alison, I will begin by introducing you, and thank you so much to you and Victoria and our other speakers for offering to present today. Alison is currently an honorary research fellow at the University of Wolverhampton. She worked for several years as a dress and textile specialist at Christie's Auctioneers before completing her doctorate in the area of 19th century working class dress. She has published articles and a book, The Clothing Trade in Provincial England, 1800 to 1850, 2011, and her second book, The Hidden History of the Smock Frock, is published by Bloomsbury in May 2021. So very recently, the launch was very recent, and this is kind of, I guess, a sneak preview of the content in that book. If you haven't yet purchased a copy, maybe we'll see an uptick in sales after today's event, who knows? But Alison, I'm going to hand over to you now, and we look forward to hearing your paper.
Well, thank you, Veronica, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present this afternoon. In 1842, Thomas Weller set out from Whitchurch, a small village in Oxfordshire, to cross the River Thames at the bottom of the hill. On the other side of the river was Pangbourne in Berkshire, described as a pleasant village by Pickett's Directory of 1844, with its various shops serving its local population of 104 people and its rural hinterland. And this is just a 19th century engraving of Pangbourne, where you can see the bridge over the river and that it's actually quite a rural place. Although close to Reading, around 6 miles away, it still had a selection of general shops, including John Varnell, a tailor, and Thomas Dew, a draper, where Thomas is likely to have bought the smock frock and 3 handkerchiefs that he purchased in the village. From the 1841 census, Thomas appears to be an agricultural labourer, aged about 21. Obviously, after such a shopping trip, refreshments was needed, so on his way back home, he stopped at a beer house in Whitchurch and also the Lawrence Public House, probably before walking back up the hill home. And you can see here, this is obviously a later photograph, but it's kind of how I like to imagine Thomas might have been in. The pub was a site of male sociability, a place where men could congregate and enjoy themselves beyond the elite gaze. Thomas apparently showed off his new purchases to fellow acquaintances, and I'm sure we can imagine the scene ourselves, recalling showing off with a certain amount of pride what we've just bought to our friends and acquaintances after a shopping trip, at least in more normal times. Witnesses stated that Thomas appeared quite drunk, and one of these acquaintances was later accused of stealing and pawning Thomas's bundle of new clothing in Reading, where there were several pawnbrokers, and the anonymity of a larger town would allow him more time to undertake his deception. So this snippet from the Oxford Chronicle and Reading Gazette newspaper, recording a prosecution, thus gives us details about smocks, which perhaps go against the traditional way of thinking about the garment, and also the relationship between 19th century working men and their clothes. So breaking it down, we can see that working men might shop for their own clothes. The smocks they bought were ready-made from a shop, not produced at home, and they were sold even in small settlements. And perhaps working men also had a certain amount of pride in their clothing, spending their hard-earned wages on their appearance, as well as revealing cultures of working-class male sociability. My research into smocks has thus been a way to delve into the clothing cultures of working people, and particularly male clothing cultures. My inspiration was the work of Beverly Lemire and the tales that she uncovered lurking in the Old Bailey records, their clothing thefts revealing vibrant clothing and a multiplicity of garments that 18th and early 19th century working people in London dealt with and wore that were not really visible elsewhere, either materially or in other written evidence. The smock is an odd working class garment as it exists on 2 levels. There's the idea and representation of the smock, which is no longer exclusively working class. Here, the smock, since the late 19th century, has come to encompass the very idea of the rural, handcrafted, unchanging, almost folk. In this iteration, it was taken up as middle class and elite children's wear, so it gets rolled up into childhood sentiment too, and of course also women's wear in the 20th and 21st centuries. Photographs of the last smock wearers from around 1900 to 1910, elderly men who'd worn them all their lives, also colour how we think about them. so they're commonly perceived as used by people at either end of the age spectrum, worn by the very young or the elderly, as you can see here. However, rather than the subsequent representations of the smock, it is the level beneath this which has fascinated me and has become my current research joy, the smock trade hidden in the 19th century as part of working class clothing cultures. As I've mentioned, the buying and selling of smocks is an important part of my research, and I would argue clothing acquisition is an integral part of researching any working class clothing. By looking at retailers' advertisements, for example, a much broader spectrum of clothing is revealed by the terminology they use than we might expect. It was while I was examining provincial clothes retailing in Berkshire and Oxfordshire that I came across more evidence of how widespread the smock trade was in mid-19th century England. From running at high street drapers in the early 19th century, during the 1840s, Hydes of Abingdon developed a factory in the town. John Hyde Jr. had succeeded his father in the business in 1833 at the age of 35. He began to focus on wholesale rather than just retailing, in 1840 being listed as a wholesale clothes manufacturer, the earliest directory reference to his manufactory. The firm was specifically wholesale slop and frock makers by 1844, when Hyde bought a former hemp manufacturing factory on the same street of his house. And you can see here, this is just a street map from Abingdon, where the clothing factory is here. So it's quite close to the River Thames. And this is how it looks today. The factory is obviously not there anymore, that it survived into the 20th century and it's been replaced by these red brick flats, and the river's just beyond there where the tree is. So, in 1847, the Hyde family's shop in Reading advertised, "One of the most important articles of domestic economy is dress at J. Hyde's round frock and ready-made clothes warehouse," their factory's main trade at first being in smocks or frocks, another term for them since the 17th century. By the 1851 census, John Hyde Sr., aged 72, is described as a cloth manufacturer employing 1,400 persons making garments, presumably mainly as outworkers. Also noted in the census were 2 male slop cutters who would work in Hyde's receiving room, where material was cut up into garment pieces and given out to women to make up into clothing. A cutter was always male and at the top of the factory workers' hierarchy, often trained through one of the only apprenticeships in the factory system. They were responsible for ensuring that there was as little wastage as possible when pieces were cut out from material to assemble into bundles for completion. This gender division of labour continued in clothing factories, women doing unskilled work, men the skilled cutting out. By 1861, mechanisation was underway. Cutting machines were used along with sewing machines made by Grover and Baker. Although at first, mechanisation caused consternation among the women and a small riot. When John Hyde Sr. died in 1864, the firm was reported as one of the most extensive of the few modern model factories and wholesale houses in the kingdom for the manufacture and supply of machine-made clothing for the home trade, with employee numbers increased to 1,500 outworkers and 350 employees in the factory. These numbers were not unusual for towns involved in clothing manufacture. Colchester too had similar employment figures by the late 19th century, mainly women and girls employed as outworkers, as did Haverhill in Suffolk, another smock-making town. As with the London clothing slop trades, the provincial ready-made smock trade was based primarily on female outwork, both in the town and also in the surrounding villages, using women who would provide the handwork needed to smock, embroider, and make up garments. Slopping could add 2 or 3 shillings to a household's weekly income. A local surgeon, William Lightfoot, described working conditions to parliamentary commissioners, noting that women preferred field work to needlework, plenty of which they can get from a tailor's establishment at Abingdon, though the same was not true of girls. Older women spudding thistles, questions at Culham, which is very close to Abingdon, just over the other side of the river, suggested that they earned more at 8p per day for 8 hours' work than a woman doing slopping would, although the wear on their clothing and particularly their shoes was more. However, overall, field work was seen as healthier than slopping and popular for women aged 30 to 40. but girls and young women ended up working at home or increasingly in the factory as production mechanised. By the 1860s, the work was described as making clothing for the Oxford and Abingdon ready-made clothes shops for railway labourers or navvies, trousers, waistcoats and smocks, rather than for agricultural labourers. And this is just one of the few surviving bills which I found associated with the Hyde Company. This is actually for Thomas Hyde, who was John's brother, who set up a shop and small manufactory in Oxford. And you can see they're supplying trousers for Oxford's jail here. So employment in the surrounding hinterland was very much bound up with firms such as Hyde's. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the terms slop and smock here. As we understand it today, slops are cheap ready-made clothes, made probably since the 17th century and possibly earlier, usually made at first for government contracts for organisations such as the Army and Navy, those emigrating forced otherwise to the colonies, and later also particularly associated with sailors' trousers. In the 15th century, slop is also a term for a loose piece of outerwear, so it has a specific connection to smocks, but through both of these, partly because they're early ready-made garments too, and used by men such as sailors from the mid-18th century onwards. Certainly by the early 19th century, the terms slop and smock and also frock are used interchangeably throughout different parts of the country. And there's a court case in Tring in Hertfordshire in 1840, which is determined by what the garment is called on the indictment, which varies from smock frock to round frock and slop, depending on who is describing it. I just wanted to highlight this sort of complexity of terminology and the problems that it throws up, not all of which I can resolve, especially when we're dealing with garments which on the whole don't survive in the broadest spectrum and for which there's limited written evidence even in the 19th century. So slop becomes almost colloquial language for smock in court reports as a kind of loose overall, often a garment which is removed and left lying around, and apparently remains a term used in the counties around the Welsh borders for what we might call a smock. And I just want to show you this list of provincialisms, this one from Leicester and Lincolnshire, where you can see a slop or smock frock, a loose outside garment. These sort of provincialisms were collected around this sort of period where sort of dialects were thought to be diluting with the sort of encroachment of urbanisation and migration into towns. So they're quite useful for trying to find out these sort of terms. Of course, it's up for debate how smocks and worked these garments were, and if there were differences in length. For example, smocks were sold in different lengths and sizes from the early 19th century, the shorter ones increasingly winning in popularity. And there may be differences which are lost in a one or two word description. But I think these sort of complexities of terminology are hard to unpick, but the links which emerge can be fascinating. The smock trade proved lucrative during the mid-19th century, with a London slop wholesaler, the Bousfield family, also setting up a similar operation in nearby Reading down the Thames. There's a court case in Reading, probably relating to Bousfield smocks, where a woman outworker is accused of pawning her work to raise cash, a not uncommon strategy, but technically illegal, as the goods didn't belong to her. That her pay rates were very low were questioned in court. She was earning 2.5 pence per smock, although she remarked she could make 3 smocks in a day. Speaking to people who make smocks today, something which I've not yet attempted, this seems an incredible work rate. Of course, it may be a boast, but it also might not be far from reality, as many smocks were not as we think about them today. Short ones had minimal smocking, perhaps just at the cuffs and small panels across the torso, and ones which were fully smocked were often quite crudely worked with little embellishment and seams which were often sewn quickly with running stitch. And this is just a detail from Arthur Smith's smock, who appears on the cover of my book, where it's just show you an example of this sort of crudely put together smock. Smocks were hard wearing, the ideal ready-made garment with little fitting required and inexpensive, especially in comparison to jackets and coats, often just a couple of shillings each new, essentially workwear and overall. Because of this, they were worn by many men, not just the stock agricultural labourer or shepherd. And I just wanted to say something about cost here, another incredibly complex area. I've emphasised that smocks were often purchased by men such as Thomas Weller, possibly because they were cheaper than other clothing, partly because they could be made ready-made by women paid very low wages. However, in comparison to clothing today, they're still expensive, and perhaps one reason why Thomas Weller was showing off his new sartorial status. The average weekly wage for agricultural labourers was around 8 shillings in the mid-19th century, although there's variation both between occupations and areas. A garment costing 2 shillings or the more usual 4 or 5 shillings was still a lot of money, and clothing would therefore be repaired, often personalised with embroidery or buttons, for example, and looked after with care. So if you do a very broad modern extrapolation with average weekly wages, the cheapest smock is still costing sort of £125 to £250. So having found this huge trade in a specific area of men's working class clothing through considering smocks, slops and shopping, I want to move my research forward, looking at how male workwear developed in the latter part of the 19th century as the use of the smock rapidly declined and was difficult to manufacture as a hybrid garment, remaining partly handmade. I aim to examine the manufacture and consumption of, for example, corduroy and moleskin trousers, which Hydes moved into, jackets and work shirts worn by labourers in many different employment fields. How much distinction was there in the marketplace, and what did this clothing mean to their wearers? I've uncovered tantalising glimpses through searching for smock evidence. There's an oral history recording taken in the 1970s, where George Swinford from Filkins, a small village in rural Oxfordshire, talks about his father Joe sending off his measurements on a form to a hardware tailor's in Rugeley, Staffordshire, to buy ship canal trousers. These cord trousers cost 10 and 6 in the early 1900s, again a week's wages, according to George, and had bell bottoms to stop the dirt going into the boots. The hardware tailor in Rugeley at this time was John Keyes, who is also thought to have developed the donkey jacket for navvies working on the Manchester Ship Canal, built between 1887 and 1893, although I haven't verified this claim at the moment. His advertisements show exactly the type of form that Swinford talks about. And you can see, send a postcard for patterns, which would be small samples of material, and measurement forms, which George's father would fill out and send back. And the best quality cords or moleskins were 10 and 6, as George recalls. So it's these types of businesses and their retailing methods which are currently intriguing me. There also seem to be huge colonial export markets to Africa and to Australia in particular. So if anyone is working on anything comparable or has any information or wants to collaborate or knows of any funding, please let me know. And this is finished with an image of some of the Manchester Ship Canal navvies who are wearing this type of clothing. So thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Alison, for an absolutely fascinating paper, and it has generated a lot of questions in the chat, for which thank you for everybody who has added. As questioners privilege, I'm going to ask a couple of questions to start off with, which I hope you won't mind. The embroidered smocks that you've shown in the slides, how far back do they date being used by working class people, and are there regional differences in the patterning of the smocking designs?
Well, the actual smocking as we would think about it today starts in the late 18th century, and they don't actually become that embroidered until sort of 1830, that kind of date. Before that, they just have sort of slight panels of smocking with honeycomb stitch, as it's called. So that's the kind of broad spectrum. As to regional differences, it's a slightly, it's one of those sort of contentious things. I mean, I think obviously where there are particular workers working and you get sort of patterns being copied between women, that will give it a regional difference. Obviously the Newark smock from Nottinghamshire is a very specific design type as well. Again, I think that's almost advertised as kind of, it's like a brand almost from Newark, that you get your Newark smock, and they're recognised around the country. So there are areas where there are particular types of smock, but I don't know whether that's more by accident rather than design, as it were.
Oh, thank you very much indeed. Joseph Lewis asks, would the image of the blue smock that you showed at the start of your talk be a hand-tinted glass lantern slide for presentation and the actual smock be white, or are there regional variants in colour?
Yeah, I think actually it may have come out difference in the colour, and on my copy it's white, so there are blue smocks around as well. So blue is actually associated with Newark. They have a big dyeing industry there. So
Oh, that's
yeah, so there's blue smocks, there's green smocks, which tend to be associated with sort of Hertfordshire around there, and brown and sort of just light brown colours as well. Again, it's a bit like the embroidery patterns, that there tend to be focused on particular areas though. And I think obviously some colours are more useful for types of work than others, like the hop pickers in Kent always seem to favour green smocks because it doesn't show up the hop juice, can't think of the word, but so it sort of disguises that. So yeah,
that's very sensible indeed. In fact, Henrietta Lockett is actually thinks that she remembers seeing a blue smock in the Birmingham Museum's Trust collection. Veronica has said, it's fascinating to hear this side of the smock wearing experience. Based on what you've discovered, do you feel that these ready-made smocks differed from the smocks worn as artistic dress in the late 19th and early 20th century? And she's thinking here of the smocks that are worn in circles, like those connected with Ellen Terry or Edith Craig at Small Hythe Place in Kent. And of course, as far as I remember, William Morris also wore a smock, but I'm sure he was making, well, it's very practical, and I'm sure there's a statement to be made there as well. But anyway, is there a difference between that and artistic dress smocks?
I think there becomes a difference. I mean, I think I've sort of come around to a way of thinking that they were so cheap that that artists may have just bought them ready-made before they became a sort of artistic dress thing, just because they were so cheap and are useful overall. I mean, I know there's a story which I've talked about before in other talks with Ellen Terry chasing a milkman around the White Horse Downs because she wanted his smock, and he sent her off to a shop to go and buy one where he'd bought his from, and that's about 1900, I think. So so yeah, I mean, she's obviously bought a ready-made smock from a shop. So and there's other artists whose name I can't remember at the moment, but who are described as looking like rustics and things. So I think they're using ready-made smocks, which are just there for general wear. So and then they I think there's a photo of Mary Watts actually wearing looks something very much like a smock as well, so like an embroidered smock. So
I think
yeah, I think it varies.
Yes, I think G.F. Watts did as well, from what I remember. I'm sure I've seen a photograph of him in one. And Joseph actually asks, in connection with that, is there a sense of elitism in the language used for smocks to distinguish upper class wearing from those of agricultural labourers, for example? And he also wondered, is the card in the image that you showed, which I think you said was the cover of your book, was that a form of identification? But that was a photograph of someone who'd been arrested, was it? So presumably...
Yes, it's a prisoner photograph. So
yeah. Right.
Yeah, well, they don't really become elite wear until the late 19th century, when they become tied up with the artistic and dress reform movements, and then into the 20th century it's kind of a late flowering for smock makers, who then sort of make them for elite men and who still want to continue wearing them. So there's sort of somebody in Sussex in the 1920s, I think, who does his gardening in a smock, which kind of makes a statement. And sort of the early settlers in sort of new towns are also sort of, there's a photograph of one who also wears a smock. So it's kind of associated with those sort of, certainly for men anyway, those part of the artistic dress movement, and also sort of rural revivalism as well. So
there are lots examples of smocks being listed in the chat, and I think Veronica, you'll record that, won't you, so we can pass that on to Alison later.
Okay,
But
thank you.
last question, and that is it possible to tell the difference between a homemade and a factory-made smock?
I don't know. I mean, one of the problems, and obviously into the later 19th century, you occasionally get machine seams on smock seams, but one of the problems is even when you're talking about ready-made smocks, they're all handmade. So, I've been going around various museum collections saying, can I see your sort of rough and ready smocks rather than your brilliant embroidered wedding example smocks? But I think it is very difficult to tell what would have been made up, and obviously, I have an example of a woman who's going around Worcestershire, a bit like tailors did, moving from house to house and making all the smocks up which were required in that particular farm. So she's obviously working at speed as well. So it depends what your definition of ready-made and handmade is, I suppose. It's a difficult one.
Absolutely. Thank you very much indeed, Alison, for absolutely fascinating paper, and thank you for so many wonderful questions. And Veronica has put in the chat the link for Alison's book, so please do go across to Bloomsbury and buy a copy of it. Sounds absolutely fascinating. Veronica, I'm going to pass back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn, and thank you, Alison. That was a brilliant way to get started. And as you'll see in the chat now, you can relax and kind of look at it. There's lots of conversations going on there, and we love seeing that. And as Lynn mentioned, we always pass the chat on to our speakers after the event as a kind of record. So anything you add there really is appreciated by them. And on the subject of speakers, I need to introduce our second speaker, who is Victoria Osborne. And I will just read out her bio now. So Victoria is Curator of Fine Art at Birmingham Museum Trust and is an Honorary Research Fellow at the University of Birmingham. She has curatorial responsibility for the City of Birmingham's collections of paintings, drawings, and sculpture pre-1900, and has a specialist interest in British 19th century works on paper. Her recent research focuses on networks of artists and makers in Birmingham associated with the pre-Raphaelites and arts and crafts movement. She was co-curator with Martin Ellis and Tim Barringer for the exhibition Victorian Radicals, organised by the American Federation of Arts and BMT, which is currently touring the United States. Wow, that's impressive under current conditions. The exhibition presents over 200 fine and decorative art objects from Birmingham's collection, together with a small number of key objects from private lenders, and displays textiles, ceramics, stained glass, jewellery and metalwork, alongside paintings, drawings and printed books. And we're looking forward to hearing her paper. Thank you, Victoria. I'm going to hand over to you now.
Thank you, Veronica. I'll share my screen. Okay, well, thank you very much to 19th Century Dress and Textiles Reframed for having me to speak today. This is the first time I've presented on this research in progress, and as somebody who's new to the field of textile and dress, it's really exciting to have this opportunity to join this research community. Before I start, I'd just like to mention that almost everything I'll be showing you today, both the textiles and the associated archival material, come from private collections. And I'd just like to say how grateful I am to the owners of that material for being so generous, both in allowing me access for my research, but also in giving me permission to include images of some of the material in my talk this afternoon. On the 13th of November 1909, the Arts and Crafts Gallery at London's Lyceum Club opened a new exhibition of embroidered textiles. On display were pieces by two artists, Birmingham designer-maker Gwendoline Kate Lewis and Constance Smedley, writer, artist and activist, and the founder and driving force of the club. In my short paper today, I want to focus on Lewis's contribution to the exhibition and to situate this event in the context of her broader career. Under her married name of Gwen Pike, Lewis would become a significant figure in the British revival of block-printed textiles in the 1920s. As chief designer and supervisor at the Footprints workshop in Chiswick from 1925 until her early death in 1929, she led the production of furnishing fabrics similar to these, together with printed shawls and other garments, which were sold at the shop Modern Textiles in Knightsbridge. Her earlier work is less often discussed, though I want to acknowledge here the work of colleagues in Birmingham who, like me, have benefited from access to the privately owned collection of textiles I'll be discussing today. Glenys Wilde represented Lewis in the exhibition Masterly Art in 1987, an important show, but one which unfortunately did not have a publication, so it's not as well known as it might be. And more recently, Zelina Garland-Rowan selected pieces by her for the touring exhibition Victorian Radicals and has catalogued them for the accompanying book. Today, by focusing on surviving embroidered textiles by Lewis that were shown at the Lyceum Club in 1909 and related archival material in private collections, I want to cast some further light on Lewis's career before the First World War and to touch briefly on the ways in which her early connections within the artistic networks of turn-of-the-century Birmingham helped to shape her practice. Established in 1903 to foster social and professional exchange between women, the Lyceum Club organised a series of exhibitions promoting fine and decorative art by female makers at its clubhouse on Piccadilly from 1905. These exhibitions, held in the Arts and Crafts Gallery you can see here, were intended to raise the status and profile of women's art across a range of media and to provide opportunities for women to sell their work, thereby earning an income from their practice and asserting themselves as professional makers. Textiles in a range of materials and techniques, including hand-woven fabrics, embroidery applied to dress, accessories and homewares, and silk pictures, were frequently featured in these exhibitions, with contributors including Annie Garnett, Charlotte Brown, Annie Reynolds-Stevens, and Kate Button. Alongside these British makers, the Lyceum Club advocated for leading textile artists from continental Europe, facilitating the showing of their work to London audiences. These connections came about largely through Smedley's own personal relationships, as the Lyceum clubs expanded internationally and Smedley continued to build her professional networks. The Dutch artist Agatha Wegerif-Gravestein exhibited batik textiles at the Lyceum, and the club's committee facilitated the German embroiderer Florence Jessie Herzl in securing a solo show of her embroidered landscapes at the Society of Artists in New Bond Street in 1904. Lewis's opportunity to exhibit likely came through her own personal connections with Constance Smedley herself. The two women were related by marriage. Smedley's cousin, the photographer William Smedley Aston, married Lewis's sister Irene in 1906, but they were also friends and had moved in the same artistic and social circles in Birmingham. Their mutual friends and acquaintances in the city included the painter Joseph Southall, the jewellers Georgie and Arthur Gaskin, and the artist and designer Maxwell Armfield, who became Smedley's husband in January 1909. As well as these social connections, the two shared left-leaning political views and an interest in and sympathy with campaigns for women's emancipation. In summer 1909, Smedley invited Lewis to join her at a summer school of the Fabian Society in North Wales, where they attended lectures and debates, sat together at dinner every night, and shared discussions of politics, contemporary social issues, and art. As the elder by 6 years and the more established of the two, both socially and professionally, Smedley supported and promoted Lewis in her career. It's notable that although in 1909 she herself was by far the better known, both to members of the Lyceum Club and, thanks to her writing, to a wider public, she ceded top billing to Lewis in the exhibition's catalogue. Like Smedley, Lewis had trained at Birmingham Central School of Art, and the two women briefly overlapped there as students in 1898. Lewis registered in 1897 at the age of 15 and studied for a total of 7 years from 1897 to 8 and again from 1900 to 1906. Her training in needlework came through Mary Newell, then senior lecturer in embroidery, and from May Morris, who was special teacher of needlework by invitation of the school between 1899 and 1902. Like all of the training at the School of Art, the needlework course was practically focused, centred on learning through designing and making. It gave students a thorough grounding in technical and practical needleworking skills, but also emphasised the importance of good design in underpinning their work. This photograph, showing Lewis's contemporaries in the needlework class, shows students apparently engaged in drawing as well as stitching, and includes examples of the potted plants from which they studied flowers and leaves from nature to inspire their designs. The presence on the blackboard in the background of examples both of naturalistic flower studies and of simplified floral motifs is consistent with May Morris's injunction in her book Decorative Needlework in 1893 that the artist should study natural forms closely, but that their work should, quote, merely recall nature, not absolutely copy it. A study for a Christmas card, designed by Lewis as a student in 1903, shows her essaying the pattern-making skills learned at the school, which she would apply in her embroidered designs, like the bag on the right. The arrangement of stylized forms of grapes, ivy leaves, and flowers among curling tendrils owes a debt to Newell's embroidered work, but also responds to Morris's instructions on creating designs in which, quote, the forms are all simplified, leaves flatly arranged, stems bent into flowing curves to fill the required spaces. Lewis exhibited 2 frames of embroidery at the 6th exhibition of the Arts and Crafts Exhibition Society in London in 1899. But her showing at the Lyceum Club 10 years later seems to have been the first occasion on which she exhibited a substantial body of work. She submitted 25 garments for women and children in a range of fabrics, shantung and tussar silk, cotton, serge, and muslin, all embellished with embroidery, mostly of wildflower motifs. Alongside these, she showed a small group of accessories, book covers and silk embroidered bags, probably similar to the examples shown here. The exhibition included both works for sale and objects lent by their owners, so they could have included similar items similar to this book cover, made for Lewis's brother-in-law, William Smedley Aston, and embroidered for him with his initials. The production of items like these, not only handmade for the recipient but carefully personalised, aligns with arts and crafts principles in privileging the handcrafted over the mass-produced and the individual over the generic. However, such principles were also consistent with the stated aims of the Lyceum Club exhibitions, which, as Zoe Thomas notes, promoted what Smedley called the pleasure in gifts or articles of furniture or personal adornment made specially over things manufactured by the score with no individual meaning. Of Lewis's surviving textile works, at least 2 can be positively identified as having been exhibited at the Lyceum. The first is this tea dress in tussar silk with an embroidered collar, constructed to fall in soft pleats from the shoulders. Its muted tone of dusky grey purple would have met with May Morris's approval, being consistent with her view that this hue, although difficult to obtain, was, quote, a very beautiful, and if I may say so, poetic colour. The sailor collar in light tussar silk is bordered with a geometric pattern in blue, pink, purple, and gold silks, and embellished with a design of stylized leaves and forget-me-nots. A second tea gown also survives, made in apple green tussar silk with trellis sleeves. The narrow velvet ribbons are layered crisscross over a white chine with a subtle pattern of roses and are studded at each crossing with tiny coral beads, as you can see in the close-up here. The yoke is embellished front and back with a delicate trailing pattern of stems, leaves, and scarlet pimpernel flowers. The pattern fills the space with a lightness of touch and apparent spontaneity, which belies its carefully planned design. The critic in the Morning Post observed that Lewis was, quote, so exceptionally gifted that in her embroideries she can, so to speak, let her needle play over the garments she is adorning, pursuing the ideas that suggest themselves at the moment and requiring no preconceived plan. The dress was made by Lewis for her sister, Irene, and lent by her for its showing at the Lyceum. This photograph allows us to see how Irene herself wore the dress and how she accessorized it, in this instance with a string of beads and her wedding necklace in silver and semi-precious stones made by Georgie and Arthur Gaskin. Although the construction of the dress would suggest it was intended to be worn loose and unstructured, here Irene has belted it with a cord and also appears to be wearing it over a corset. The lower sections of the sleeves have been replaced at some point in the past, but the photograph records the original cuffs, described by Smedley as creamy net ruffles like flower petals edged with green velvet. One of Smedley's key aims in organising the Lyceum Club exhibitions, as I've mentioned, was to provide opportunities for female makers to promote and sell their work. For Lewis, a presence at the club allowed her to access a new potential market of London buyers, as well as reaching at least some of the club's extensive network of members, which had grown to over 2,000 women as early as 1904. As well as selling pieces through the exhibition, Lewis took the opportunity to invite commissions and to promote her services as a teacher, advertising, quote, classes arranged at which the art of embroidery as applied to dress and the practical part of dressmaking are taught in combination. The Lyceum Club exhibition marks a transitional point between Lewis's early training and career in Birmingham and her establishment in London as an independent designer maker. It's not clear at what date she moved to the capital. In summer 1909, she was still living with her family in Birmingham, but by 1911, she's recorded at Prospect Terrace off Mecklenburgh Square in Bloomsbury, working on her own account, that is, as an independent maker, and describing her occupation in the census as designer, printed textiles, in brackets, and embroideress. Her new location off Mecklenburgh Square places her close to Smedley's parents, who also lived there. More significantly, however, it makes her one of the many young single women who chose to settle in the area from the 1900s to the 1930s, living in rented accommodation, either alone or in house shares. As Francesca Wade has discussed in her recent book, Square Haunting, Mecklenburgh Square and the streets around it provided a haven for young women, many of them artists, writers, or academics, who left the family home to live and work there independently. Gwendoline Lewis Pike is most often referenced in the context of her block-printed textiles of the 1920s. However, her training in Birmingham and her early arts and crafts practice form a significant part of her work and were central to forming her creative identity. Although the Lyceum Club exhibition ran for only a week, it represents a pivotal moment in her career. The survival of identifiable key pieces from this exhibition allows us to consider them in the wider context of her production and makes possible a more rounded understanding of Lewis's achievements as a textile designer, maker, and embroiderer. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Victoria, for an absolutely fascinating paper. As somebody who specialises in art embroidery, I don't even know where to start. I've got so many questions and I don't want to hog the chat. Gosh, where to begin? I thought it was absolutely fascinating to hear about the Lyceum Club, of which I know very, very little. I just wondered, really, did she have any links, for example, and I don't think she did because I've done a lot of research on the Royal School of Art Needlework. I don't think she had any links with the school, but did she have any links with the Decorative Needlework Society, do you know? Or is she very much independent of those?
Well, this is something that I don't know. I'd like to find out more about what other bodies she might have kind of had connections with, particularly after she moved to London, because I'm conscious, again, as somebody who's quite new to this field, I'm conscious that there are a number of bodies existing at this point to promote women's needleworking. And because I'm quite new to the field, I don't quite know how to tap into how to kind of find the membership of those organisations. So at the moment, I'm not really aware of that. And I'd really welcome some guidance of sort of where to go next.
If you get in touch with me, Victoria, I can have a look through the records, the early ones for the Royal School, and check if she appears in that. I don't think she does, because she would have had to have been brought in as a tutor. She certainly wouldn't have come in, I don't think, as a member of staff, because most of the members of staff had gone through the school as in their training programme and then become workers at the school. And of course they're there because they're women of gentlewomen status in distressed circumstances, and she doesn't come into that category. But I wondered if she perhaps had any connection as a teacher. Now, the Decorative Needlework Society and the Ladies' Work Society are run on completely different grounds to the school. They were opportunities for people to sell their work, and a percentage was given to both organisations, and I think it was like between 10 and 20% was paid, and the rest of the money went to the maker then.
Yes. That's interesting, because it would be interesting that I suppose the gap really in her career is between 1911, when she's settling in London, and then 1925 when she turns up working at Footprints, and there's that kind of gap in between where she's presumably working independently, but yes, it's not, that's a bit of a kind of gap in her career, really.
And interesting also that she moves from embroidery to doing block printed textiles. I mean, what takes her from one to the other? I mean, one of the things I was thinking about as well as you were talking about the Lyceum Club. I mean, it's interesting at that time there are things like the Athene Society and the Amateur Arts Association, which of course are privileging the work of women who didn't need to work for a living, but who were very gifted embroiderers and designers, but were just sort of showcasing their work, because these women from the middle and upper classes in society. So it's interesting to see what they were doing. Are you publishing the research? Because I'm desperate to read more about it. And what are your plans for it?
Well, I'm really excited that there's been such a positive response to this, because this is really new stuff for me. I've come to this from being interested in the arts and crafts circle more broadly in Birmingham, and one of the reasons I came to it is because of the wonderful kind of images that there are of this circle, like that really fantastic photograph of Irene Lewis, for example. Yeah. And there are lots, one of the things I'm really interested in is the kind of presentation and self-presentation within that group, both through portraits and drawings, but also through photographs like William Smedley Aston's, and also Marion Silverstone, who was a female photographer working in Edgbaston in Birmingham. And it's kind of a fascinating group because there are so many connections which join them together, sort of professional and social and marital and artistic, and they all know each other. So, and they're such a fascinating group. So I'm really interested in sort of doing more with that. But I've slightly, it doesn't sound very academic to say, but I've slightly fallen in love with Gwendoline Lewis, and I want to know so much more about her. And so I feel kind of quite invested now. So I would love to carry on working on this, and yes, I'd love to work something up for publication at some point.
I mean, I think with these women, one does fall in love with them, and it's the only way really to get inside their heads and wonder what on earth they thought they were up to, and the circle that they join as well, because they do congregate a very interesting group of women around them, whether they're working as, and I hate using the word amateur and professional, but you know, whether they're doing it just because they've got a passion, or whether they need to do it because they need to be earning a living. But it's absolutely fascinating to see who they bring together with them in that circle. And we have some questions coming through on the chat. As a day comments, what an absolutely wonderful presentation. I'm wondering if Kate Elizabeth Bunce and her sister Mara were aware of Lewis's work. Have you come across any connection?
I haven't come across any direct connection, but they would almost certainly have known each other just from being part of that quite close-knit circle of arts and crafts workers in Birmingham during that period. So if they didn't know each other at the School of Art, they would have almost certainly crossed paths through those kind of social networks. But I haven't found a specific link between them as yet.
Right. Another guest has asked, was there any family connection with the Smedley Underwear Company?
Oh, that I don't know. I don't know the Smedley Underwear Company. So yeah, I don't know, I'm afraid. I really only know about Constance Smedley and then the kind of Smedley Aston branch of the family, but there may well be some connection that I'm not aware of.
Right, well, if the person who could post that question, if they've got any suggestions to follow up on for our speaker, that would be very helpful indeed. Joseph asks, were the photographs of the club and the school published more widely?
As in, were they published at the time, or have they been published?
At the time, yes.
I don't think
clarify that, but it's just said, were they published more widely, which implies in the past rather, yes.
Yes, well, the image of the students working in the needleworking class at Birmingham School of Art is one of the lantern slides, which is held at the School of Art archives, which are owned by Birmingham City University. And there's a whole series of those showing students working in all sorts of different environments. And there are some fascinating images of female students in the kind of common room as well, kind of relaxing there, because there was a kind of female students common room that was created in the 1890s as the number of kind of female students grew. So the fact that they were made as lantern slides suggests that they were shown publicly. And I assume that was to do with promoting the work of the school and, making more broadly, kind of raising awareness of the work that they were doing there.
Right. And a couple of similar questions actually from Kim Wall and from Joseph. Are there any personal writings or journals of these women in which they discuss their work, their reflections of each other?
Yeah, Constance Smedley wrote a lot. She wrote a very lively autobiography called Crusaders in 1929, where she talks quite a lot about the Lyceum Club, but she also wrote a lot of articles. She wrote a number of novels, many of them about women's lives and women's issues. And she also wrote an absolutely fantastic feminist polemic, which is called Woman, A Few Shrieks, on the necessity of shrieking until the shrieks be heard.
Okay.
It's 1907, and it's written with a very light touch, but it's arguing for the scope of women's activity to be kind of broadened beyond the home, and for what women can kind of bring to society if they're given more opportunity. And she does write about women's kind of creativity and embroidery and other skills as part of that context. So that's amazing. Gwendoline Lewis, there's less written. There's a handful of letters which I've come across, and the reason I know about the Fabian Society Summer School is there's a letter that she wrote home about what a fantastic time she was having at the summer school, to the extent that she was staying longer than she'd intended. And a lot of it is actually written, she's sitting and watching the people coming and going, so she talks about who's there. She talks about the fact that Constance Smedley is embroidering while kind of discoursing to an enthralled group who are all kind of gathering around her. So that gives a little kind of insight, but there isn't a diary or a journal to give a more kind of detailed account.
Thank you very much indeed. I think I'm very conscious that time is marching on, so I probably should draw to a close there on the comments and questions, but again, they'll be available for you afterwards, Victoria. And I'll pass back to Veronica now. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you so much to both you and Alison for some fascinating papers. There's just so much to talk about, but we do have to keep moving forward. And what we're going to do just to round things off today is, as I mentioned, it's a slight change to the usual format, but we've got some lightning presentations about some forthcoming research projects, 4 in total. The first of which will come from Jenny Lister, who's going to be talking about a project that she's just at the very start of, on forgotten dressmakers. So Jenny, you're very welcome to start sharing your screen. Perfect, and it's working brilliantly. You're just muted at the moment, that's all we need to change.
There we go, I've done it now. Sorry about that. Thanks, Veronica, and thanks for those talks. They're all, well, both brilliant to hear. But I'm just going to talk very quickly about this kind of tiny idea I've had for something that could hopefully grow into a kind of informal collaborative project, making use of social media and research networks such as this one. So I'm a curator at the V&A, and I'm particularly responsible for the European Textiles and Fashion collection, although I've recently curated an exhibition on Mary Quant, and so that's where people might think of me more. But Forgotten Dressmakers is the working title I'm using for now for this idea I've had, which is to kind of explore and highlight the work and lives of some of the thousands of makers who worked in the fashion industry. And I'm looking mostly at dressmakers from the late 19th century and early 20th century that are represented by garments in the V&A collection, many of which won't have been researched or displayed before, often because they're too fragile. But you often do have these wonderful labels in the dresses as a way to track down the names and explore more of the businesses and social histories and the lives of the people who actually made these dresses that survive in museum collections. And obviously this wonderful photograph here is of milliners rather than dressmakers, but it's a very inspiring image for me. It's a rare view behind the scenes at Maison Lewis, which is a huge hat making and retail operation that took up about six numbers worth of Regent Street buildings in London. And they also had a Paris showroom too. But that's sort of by the by at the moment. Has my slide moved on, Veronica? I can't see. No,
just press the arrow key and then you should move on.
No, it's not moving.
Oh, don't worry, I can always share it if necessary.
So annoying. Sorry, everyone.
No, it's fine. This is absolutely normal. We are entirely used to this. Just bear with me a second and I'll get
Has that changed now?
Let's have a look. Not yet. I'm just getting your backup show. You carry on talking, I will get your backup show up and running.
Thank you.
And it will be fine.
So I'm just showing a couple of images, one of a Worth dress and one of a dress by Kate Riley, to illustrate the sorts of dresses we have in the collection at V&A. Often they're too fragile to display. And so I want to use these labels as a way into this kind of social history behind. And the House of Worth dress is relevant, particularly because we've got the bicentenary, the 200-year anniversary of the birth of Charles Frederick Worth coming up in 2025. And I want to use this bicentenary as an opportunity to develop a research project about the 19th century origins of couture and expand that to include the many, many neglected court dressmakers. And so 2025 should be the ideal time to stage a major exhibition on Worth, kind of putting him in context, which could also highlight other people's work. Although, of course, with so much uncertainty and the financial issues of the moment, there are a huge number of challenges to such an exhibition, perhaps even more so than usual. But I'm actually determined that we should do everything we can to make the most of the opportunities offered by this bicentenary year. And I'm lucky to have support at the V&A for this idea, and I'm working particularly with Claire Allen Johnston, who's also here today online. And of course, there is an awful lot we can do online, regardless of what may or may not be possible in terms of a physical exhibition. For instance, we're hoping to get funding to digitise the Worth archive, which is partly at the V&A and partly at the Fashion Museum in Bath. Can you move the slide on, Veronica? Thanks. So while we work on funding proposals and possible institutional collaborations, I wanted to see if there might be interest amongst the group here in building up a kind of parallel story, a resource about the other dressmakers, to build up a body of research that could even snowball and become perhaps a sort of online directory or a family tree, which could show the links between these different businesses. For instance, V&A trained apparently at Kate Riley. So I have to admit that I've only relatively recently discovered Twitter, and I'm kind of learning how to do it still. But I've put together this kind of experimental example with this thread about Kate Riley, and it uses research I did for a book I edited with Lou Taylor and Cassie Davies-Strodder on the Heather Fairbank collection. And I hope this shows the sort of thing I mean. Otherwise, I'm not particularly active on Twitter at all, and I know I need to develop those kind of skills. And I won't go through this in detail now, but basically, if you read through the thread, it shows how working through street directories, the digitized newspapers, and the census, I actually found out who was behind this brand, Kate Riley, who was actually a lady called Harriet, and her husband, of course, is well documented with a long career in the army, but that's another story. Next slide, please, Veronica. But I really love the way you can find these kind of short and digestible chunks of information on Twitter, and using a hashtag like Forgotten Dressmakers seems to be a great way of collating the knowledge that's already out there, kind of build it into something bigger in a free, sustainable way. And it could also help to map and bring together surviving examples of dresses by particular makers where they're held in different collections. And really it would help to get away from this established canon of well-known, well-publicised male designers such as Worth. The final slide, please, Veronica. Thank you. So this resource could highlight unpublished existing research on makers such as Madame Elise, and I know Kate Strasden's done work on her. Susan North has worked on Redfern, which isn't published. Veronica, we were talking earlier about Mrs. Nettleship, and I'd just love to know more about her. And basically, I also should say as well that Edwina has done a huge amount of work in this territory, and she's taught me how to do this kind of tenacious genealogical research. And I know it might overlap with existing projects, but it could also promote other projects, such as the tailoring project that Veronica is going to talk about later on Suzanne Rowland's behalf. But for me, it's a key aim to kind of try and find out more about the people in the workrooms. And I'm very inspired by this book by Hallie Rubenhold, The Five, about the victims murdered by Jack the Ripper. And I think she showed in amazing detail how it's possible to build up individual and quite complete pictures of the lives of working class and poor women who were obviously employed in some of these places. So I'll stop talking very soon, but basically I just want to kind of launch this idea. I need to go off and do more research into other makers such as M.E. Humble that you see on this middle, the tape in the waistband here, and I like the sound as well of the Mrs. Nimmo who were in Mayfair. And I'm going to write a quick thread soon about Mrs. Cyril Drummond, who set up the House of Mascot. Although really I'd love this to get away from the London-centric nature, which obviously is very much what we have in the V&A collection for this period. But I think this could pull in local history sources and family historians, adding to the pool of knowledge about people who worked in the fashion industries. And in my dreams, it could become quite a significant public history project with broad coverage across time and geography. But anyway, thanks for listening to me sort of talk through this possibility. I'd love to know what people think, and maybe there's already something out there that I've missed. Also, I'd like to sort of welcome any tips from any experienced tweeters for making this sort of idea work. So please do make suggestions or ask questions in the chat, or email me directly at the address you can see on the screen now. And it would be great here to hear more about these lesser known labels and the people behind these brands. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jenny. That was brilliant. We've got some comments coming into the chat, and I will also circulate details of this around the email list. But to keep things moving, everyone do keep adding your comments to the chat for Jenny, but I'm going to pass over to Joseph now, who's going to briefly share with us some details about a dress and textile collection that he works with. So sort of showcasing a research resource that may be of use to you all. So Joseph, we're just waiting for your screen to load. I think it's just taking a minute.
Can everyone see my screen?
We can now.
It's quite a high resolution PDF. Yeah.
Yeah.
So forgive the image in the centre there. I'm not sure who that is. And so this is I am the Heritage Coordinator. We've recently changed. We're going to be changing our name to the South Somerset Heritage Collection. But when this leaflet was printed, and we still currently are, the Community Heritage Access Centre, we're in Yeovil, not far from Yeovil, in South Somerset. I put in the chat earlier, we're about 20 miles from Taunton and about 45 miles from Exeter. I was just thinking of those in Canada, and that might be a little bit, but we're in the southwest of England. So we have a collection of costume, and we are interesting because unlike some of the places that we've had other speakers from today, like Victoria or Jenny's experience, we are a building within a building on an industrial site, about 3 miles from a town centre, and we're not open at the weekends. And so we're open Monday to Friday, 9 till 5, and we don't have a display area other than a grant-funded display cabinet that we purchased for our local library. So we thought we would look at publishing, because we're a local authority, South Somerset District Council, so we can print things in our own print room. What aspects of our collection could we display about, putting this leaflet up on Facebook or our Twitter account, and what sort of leaflets could we produce? So we had a lot of interest in the costume collection, people coming on guided tours, which we can have pre-pandemic, of course, in small groups. We could have up to about 10 in a group. So local University of the Third Age groups, for example, were interested in coming round and seeing the costume. The interesting thing always, perhaps Jenny would have a similar empathise with this, is people always come and see us and say, oh, everything's covered up. It's because we don't have, unless like we did Heritage Open Day, we had 2 items on mannequins prepared the day before, but that was a special arrangement. So this was normally in the picture with me in what people would come to actually experience the costume collection. So we thought we could do a number of things, one of which was, because of our industrial nature of our site, we're an accredited museum, but we're more an environmental controlled store with public access, as opposed to public accessible museum. So we thought through the leaflet, we can just give a small sample of one section of the collection, namely the costume and textiles, because we have a tourist information centre in the centre of town and on the edge of the A303 dual carriageway. So it would help to and see how that went before we see called the glovers, because we produce gloves in Yeovil from about 18.
Might be having a slight technical difficulty there. We'll hope that we get Joseph back. If not, I'll make sure I add details to the chat. And we also have a PDF of the leaflet he was sharing there that I can circulate to everyone who's attended today and through the mailing list. So I'll just check if he's still in our list of participants. It looks like he may have dropped out at the crucial moment. So I'm conscious of time. So Lynn, if you could keep half an eye to see if he comes back in. But whilst we're waiting for that, I will try and bring up my PowerPoint, which involves a bit of, this is about Joseph's thing he was showing you. Here's part of the leaflet that you didn't get to see, and a link to some more information about the collection he was discussing. But I will move on to a project I'm very conscious is not my project. It was going to be introduced by Suzanne Rowland, and I have seen Lou Taylor at points in the audience, and she knows far more about this project than me because she's a co-organizer of this project. Unfortunately, Suzanne can't be with us because she's had a bad reaction to her second COVID jab and is currently resting and in much need of rest. So basically, to give you a précis of what she was going to discuss, she's actually promoting specifically a 2-day international online conference that's going to take place on the 18th and 25th of September, and that really focuses on women's tailored clothes across Britain, Ireland, Europe, and America between 1750 and 1920. And their call for papers is still open. It's open until the 21st of June, so you've just about got time to sneak in an abstract if you have an idea. And I suspect if you have a good idea and you need a teeny bit longer, the organisers may be willing to be slightly flexible on that deadline. They've been promoting this conference through their Twitter account, which the handle for which is on this slide, @tailoreddress. And they're very keen to highlight the fact that day one is specifically focusing on the Irish context. And focusing on an area of dress history that has been perhaps underrepresented in the current discourse. And in the second day, which is sort of a week later, this focus shifts to Europe and America. And it's part of a bigger European-wide project with the ACORSO Research Interest Group. And it's aiming to make the first trans-European comparative study of the development and consumption of mass manufactured tailored garments for women, made or sold in department stores and by wholesale ready-to-wear companies in sort of 1860 to 1914 period. And they're looking at clothes that represent developments in sartorial modernity, sort of like specially designed tailored suits and coats worn for travel. They're interested in innovative methods of manufacturing, from couture to the cheapest mass production, and also, importantly, the wider social context of wearing tailored garments and the blouses worn beneath, something Suzanne knows a lot about. And just thinking about these as sartorially significant, newly fashionable garments, finally affordable to the mass of urban women in this period, and also the related second-hand trade. So what Suzanne really wanted to do today was just raise awareness of the project as a whole and the conference in general, so that it's on your radar. Lou, if you have anything to add, you are very welcome to chip in here. But I know you weren't expecting that, so I feel a bit guilty kind of turning the spotlight to you.
Can you hear me? I don't need to add anything. That was terrific. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Brilliant. Well, it's great that we have your seal of approval, and thank you for joining us today. I know you will have loved today's papers. So what I'll do is, if you have any questions about that, please add them to the chat, and I will pass them on to Suzanne, who will respond to them. What I'm going to do now is selfishly move on to a project which I am working on, and it's a final lightning presentation that we're sharing. And it's a project that sort of actually very neatly ties in to an extent with what Jenny was discussing. It's called Constructing Costume Histories, and like Jenny's project, it's very new and we're only just beginning to develop it. But I'm working with Jade Halbert at the University of Huddersfield, and our aim is to showcase the crucial contribution of costume makers to histories of costume and dress, and sort of really putting a spotlight on makers as contributors to knowledge and creators of knowledge, and highlighting the fact that within theatre history, costumes are neglected, but costume makers are even more neglected, because like dressmakers, they're very rarely documented. And we're trying to work to rediscover those histories, but also to actually work with sort of contemporary documentation of costume making as a practice. And what we're really keen to do is bridge artificial divides between academia and the museum and makers, and say, well, why should there be divisions between those fields? They're all interconnected and we all have a right to contribute to that discussion. It's something we're endeavouring to do through this network as well. And we had our first launch event in April this year online. We didn't record it specifically because we spoke to the speakers and they felt much more confident doing it as a live theatrical experience. But what we did do is endeavour to capture it through our Twitter and Instagram accounts. So we wrote stories that kind of captured highlights of the papers. And we're having, we hope, an in-person event in September. It may only be possible to open it up to students at Huddersfield due to COVID restrictions, but our aim with that event is to do some live recordings, and we will be sharing those with whoever is interested in participating. And this network really is open to anyone who has any kind of tangential interaction with this research area. We'd love to hear from you, be you a maker, be you a researcher touching on this subject, or if you're just general interest in this area. So I think that's probably enough from me on that project. If you do have questions about it, again, add them to the chat or contact us directly through Twitter and Instagram. It is an evolving project. We have big ambitions and big dreams. We'll see how far we get achieving them, but we are going to keep it going and keep adding content to Twitter and Instagram about what we discover and who we collaborate with. And I will finish my sort of showcase of lightning talks with just a summary of the projects you heard about. We are sorry we didn't get a full overview of the collection at Yeovil, but it's one of many fascinating dress and textile collections. The dress and textile specialists are doing a lot to raise awareness of collections around the countryside, but there's always more to discover. You always find through conversations, there's something you haven't looked at, and I'm definitely gaining new appreciation through collections, through the papers we've been sharing. If you do have any questions, do add them to the chat or get in touch through our Gmail, but otherwise, I will start drawing things to a close by giving you the opportunity for final questions to our main speakers today, and just reminding you of our key details. And as Ade said, that she's submitted an abstract to the tailoring conference, so that's a great addition to the chat there. And Lou is celebrating, brilliant. Okay, so any final questions from the floor for our speakers or about those projects? Whilst you're thinking, or if Lynn, if you want anything, do shout out if there are any. Whilst you're all thinking, just a reminder of our contact details for this network. We do have a Facebook account, some Instagram and Twitter. We're better on Twitter at the moment, but we are going to be working on our Instagram. And we obviously have our email address and our gist mail that you can sign up to. We're gradually loading these presentations on YouTube. And as I said at the start, that is going to accelerate over the summer, I hope, because I will have more time to devote to making sure they all have subtitles. And we have some great events in our back catalogue that we need to get on there. Thank you so much for joining us today, particularly on Father's Day. As I said, we're aware that wasn't the best date to pick, and so we're all the more grateful for your presence. I need to thank our speakers, Victoria and Alison, such wonderful papers, such amazing images. It was just a joy to see them and to hear about your research. And also to Jenny and Joseph, thank you both for sharing your research with us. And Jenny, I think you're going to be getting, I hope, inundated with suggestions for forgotten dressmakers. I'll definitely write you a thread on Mrs. Nettleship. I've been longing to share her work and some of the collections that her pieces have ended up in. It gives me a chance to combine museum collections with dressmakers. And thank you all for joining us at this event. And also final thank you, before I forget, to Lynn for fielding questions so well and giving me some much needed support today. I really appreciate it.